Welcome to the Copperspice YouTube channel, and thanks for joining us. In this video, we are going to discuss open source software. Copyright, copyleft. Most software can be divided into three categories: closed software, free software, and open source software. We are going to go over the differences between these and then talk about copyrights and licenses. This information is very important for everyone who writes software, uses a library in their development work, and also end users.
One of the reasons why software licensing is so important is because it has so many consequences. For example, you may or may not be able to distribute source code or display or demonstrate software. Sometimes you're prohibited from charging fees for a particular piece of software, or you might have legal requirements around binary releases. The question of how changes are treated in an open source project can be quite complex, and you can even find yourself in a situation where you can't use particular open source code in your projects at work. There are many questions you may not have considered, like when can you use open source software on a server? Can you give a friend the binaries for an open source program legally? And how is copyright transferred? Is a verbal agreement adequate? Another factor to consider are the penalties which can be assessed if someone decides to take legal action. There are consequences for breaking the rules about what you can and cannot do. And if you are warned about an infringement, the consequences can be significantly larger. The penalties for willful infringement can be tripled.
We want to be very clear. We are not lawyers, and this is not legal advice. However, we have real-world experience dealing with intellectual property disputes. I was working on a consulting project, and the client decided they didn't want to pay the agreed-upon consulting fees. They demanded my source code, and this turned into a legal issue. I hired an intellectual property lawyer to handle the case. Their first lawyer was ironically a divorce lawyer, which made no sense. They switched to a general lawyer, but they never found it necessary to hire an intellectual property lawyer, which was a mistake on their part. I ended up in a much better position because their lawyer did not understand intellectual property law.
On another project, the client began asking for us to add features which would allow them to cheat in their accounting system. We refused to do this on the grounds that those features were unethical. The client assumed at that point that we would hand over all the source code and they could take it to another consultant. After a few threats from the client, we retained the services of an intellectual property lawyer. Their lawyer was knowledgeable about contract law, but knew nothing about intellectual property. The interesting point is that in one of the letters, their contract lawyer cited some case law, which had actually been set by our intellectual property lawyer in court. And their lawyer misquoted and misrepresented the meaning of the precedent that had been set in that case. This issue was ultimately resolved in our favor. Both of these experiences underscore how important it is, when there is a legitimate dispute about intellectual property, to retain the services of a very qualified and respected intellectual property lawyer. It is a very specialized area of law, and any other lawyer is unlikely to give you the result that you desire. So closed source software is often referred to as proprietary software, or sometimes you'll hear it called shrink-wrap software. This is the typical software that you might buy. It's generally distributed as a binary without the corresponding source code and sold for a profit at retail. This software is entirely paid for and developed by the company that sells it. This company hires all the developers, determines the direction of their software projects, decides what to put into those products. If you work for a company that develops closed source software, you must understand that everything you work on belongs to your employer and cannot be used for your private purposes unless you have a legal arrangement with your employer saying so.
If you want to use any of the software that you developed, while being an employee at a company, it is imperative that you have a binding legal arrangement in writing and reviewed by a lawyer.
The Free Software Foundation is a nonprofit organization started in the 80s, and it's closely linked to Richard Stallman, its founder. It's really the center of the free software movement in the open source community. The Free Software Foundation believes it has a moral imperative to allow people to exercise their basic freedoms with respect to software. And they have codified a set of freedoms that they believe are important to provide.
The Free Software Foundation has established 4 basic freedoms. Run the software for any purpose, study and change the software, redistribute copies of the source code, and distribute modified source code. Unless these 4 foundations are secured, it is not free software. Anytime we start talking about free software, somebody will bring up the idea of free beer. The term free software has become muddled. The intent of the word free was to inspire you to think of freedom, as in the 4 freedoms we just discussed.
Free software does not mean it is provided free of charge. The confusion comes from the fact that, although it is not required, the vast majority of free software is also available at no charge.
Freeware is often confused with free software. Just because a product is available for free does not mean it respects the 4 basic freedoms of the Free Software Foundation. We decided to take a look at the end user agreement for a very common freeware product, Adobe Flash Player. We were kind of surprised at what we found.
I just thought you could install Adobe Flash Player and use it. It was surprising to me how far it comes from even satisfying the first of the 4 basic freedoms, the freedom to run the software for any purpose. You may only use the Flash Player on a general-purpose desktop computer. You can't use it in any one of these environments such as a mobile device or a kiosk or an ATM or a gambling machine. You can't use the Flash Player to watch copyrighted content without the consent of the copyright holder. You can't play H.264 encoded video unless the original content creator paid patent royalties for the H.264 encoder. It did not surprise me that you would not be able to obtain or make modifications to the source code, since it is a closed source product. But it's somewhat surprising that no one other than Adobe has the freedom to distribute this software. Although anyone can download it for free at any time, you cannot give someone else a copy.
So Adobe Flash Player absolutely is freeware, but it does not satisfy the Free Software Foundation definition for freedom of using the software wherever you like.
So where does open source software fit? And in some sense, it lies between closed source and free software. The main requirement for open source is that the source code is free and freely available, and that some software license must be provided telling you what rights you have as a recipient of the source code. Those rights can vary greatly depending upon the project. When working with open source, you really need to pay attention to the terms of the software license to make sure you are using it within the constraints set by the original author. These constraints can include factors like who is allowed to modify it, how these new versions of the software can be distributed, whether you must provide the modifications back to the original author. You may or may not be able to charge a fee for the changes to the source code. You may have to pay royalties. And you may be in a bind if the upstream author decides to change the license after the fact, depending upon how that license was originally written.
All of these rights or restrictions are based on copyright law, which varies by country. The intent of copyright law is to allow the author to define who can do what with the software that they developed.
As the author of a piece of software, you hold the copyright to that source code. Anyone else who wishes to use the source code must receive a grant of the rights they need from you in some way. It is your exclusive right as the author to prohibit people from taking any of these actions with your source code unless they follow terms that you dictate. So as the author, it is up to you to define the license which grants others the right to use your software in whatever way you choose. If someone uses your software in a way outside the terms of the license, they are committing copyright infringement.
The term copyleft is a play on words coined by the Free Software Foundation. Copyleft is a type of copyright license. Once a version of source code is released under copyleft, the rights are set and cannot be changed. The author can pick a new license and release a new version, but nothing changes the license of the prior released version. In addition, no third party can take source code released under copyleft and apply a more restrictive license.
There are two main categories of copyleft licenses, strong and weak. A strong copyleft license applies not only to the project itself, but any other piece of software that uses that project, either by incorporating code from it or linking with it. As the most common example, if your product uses an external library, and that library is under a strong copyleft license, your product must be under that same strong copyleft license. On the other hand, a weak copyleft license does not affect products that link with it. A library that is licensed under a weak copyleft license must always be maintained under that same weak copyleft license. And if you copy code from the library, your project must use the same license. However, if you merely link to that weak copyleft library, your code may be under any license you wish.
Another term which is very important when we talk about open source is derivative work. This is of value because the original author has the right to prohibit derivative work or even specify the terms. Derivative work becomes a second and separate body of work independent from the first body of work. For something to be considered derivative work, the new work must contain substantial differences from the original work.
The derivative work is copyrightable and must contain a license, but your choice of license may be constrained by the license the original author put on the original work. So let's be clear what exactly a license is. The purpose of a software license is to grant rights which otherwise you would not be permitted to do because copyright law says only the copyright holder may exercise them. In essence, a software license is an agreement by the copyright holder not to sue you for infringing their copyright under certain conditions. Some people believe that a license only applies to the end user, but for an open source software project, the license also sets the rules that open source developers must observe if they are working with the project. As an open source developer, it's very important to understand the terms of the software licenses for the projects you work on. If you are the original author of a piece of open source software, you may pick any software license you wish or make up your own. It's important to make this choice wisely because the license is a legal document.
As a developer using open source software, you need to really pay attention to the license so you know exactly what you can and cannot do.
Picking a license is a very important part of starting an open source project, and many different licenses have been used by different projects. Oftentimes, corporations will develop their own license, or people will add constraints to existing licenses. If at all possible, please do not do this. Pick from one of the well-known licenses so that everyone understands the rights you are granting and it is easy for people to determine if these license terms are acceptable in their project.
This is a list of the most common open source licenses. For almost every open source project, one of these standard licenses will protect your work and at the same time allow users to easily understand their rights. There is a strong desire in the open source community to narrow down the number of licenses projects are using.
An exception to this general rule is if you're working in a particular language or environment that has a standardized license, even though it is a niche environment. For example, if you are writing a Perl module, it is wise to use the Perl artistic license because it's the license that your users will expect, as it's the license that most modules already use. The BSD series of licenses are among the most permissive open source licenses available. They place very few restrictions on how the source code can be used. They allow anyone to create derivative work and use it for nearly any purpose. The only constraints that the two-clause BSD license places is that the existing copyright must be retained so that the original author is correctly attributed, and that a copyright notice must be placed in your documentation if you distribute binaries. The three-clause BSD license adds the additional constraint that you may not use the original programmer's name to advertise your product that uses a BSD library. Other than those restrictions, you are free to use BSD licensed source code in closed source applications or for any purpose you desire.
The GPL is a strong copyleft license and requires all derivative work to maintain the same license. Another requirement of the GPL license is that anyone who receives a binary is also entitled to a copy of the source code.
Many software products adopted the GPL version 2 because it's actually a very simple and readable license. The GPL version 3 was created in response to some new issues in the free software movement regarding patents and closed hardware. The GPL version 3 requires that when you distribute your source code, you are also granting rights to use any patents that might be infringed upon by the source code. Another part of the GPL version 3 is termed the TiVo clause, after the name of a company whose behavior the Free Software Foundation wanted to prohibit. It pertains to whether a company may sell a piece of hardware that contains open source software and prohibit the user from loading modified versions of that software on the hardware they own. It's unclear whether the development of the GPL version 3 actually prevents this problem in the future, or merely causes more confusion, as many open source projects are reluctant to adopt GPL version 3 as their license.
LGPL is the most common weak copyleft license. It is very similar to the GPL, except that programs which link with an LGPL library have very few restrictions.
There are two versions of the LGPL in common usage, just like with the GPL. There is an additional issue with the LGPL version 3, which is that it is not a separate license. It is a list of changes to GPL version 3. This makes it extremely confusing to read and understand and determine what exactly your rights are under this license.
The CopperSpice library is a good example of derivative work. Since it is derivative work, we could have used both the GPL and LGPL licenses. However, we felt the weak copyleft LGPL was a better choice. Starting with Qt 5.7, they dropped the LGPL 2.1 license and switched to LGPL 3. Their stated goal was to prevent their software from being used in lockdown consumer devices without a paid license. Because of this change, anyone contributing to the Copyleft libraries cannot base their work on any source code released under the LGPL3 license. The reason is these licenses are flat out incompatible.
A similar issue comes up with the GPL because GPL version 2 and GPL version 3 are completely incompatible. There is no legal way to combine these two licenses in a single program. There is an additional issue in that LGPL version 3 is also incompatible with GPL version 2. Copyleft, as we mentioned, is licensed under the LGPL version 2.1. DoxyPress, another product we work on, is licensed under GPL 2. And we don't have the legal right to relicense it since it is derivative work. If we relicensed Copyleft under LGPL 3, it would no longer be legal for us to link DoxyPress with Copyleft, since GPL version 2 is incompatible with LGPL version 3. It is our intent to retain the LGPL 2.1 license for Copyleft, since it is compatible with the largest number of free software and open source licenses.
As another example, the libguarded library is original work of ours. We chose the BSD2 clause license since it is the least restrictive. Anyone can create derivative work based on libguarded. And libguarded or your derivative work can be used in an open source or a closed source project. Because of the BSD2 clause license, any of the changes you do make to libguarded can be kept private. However, we would appreciate if you did offer them upstream.
These open source licenses are based in very solid legal foundation. There was a legal case won in 2008 for copyright infringement of an open source project. In this case, a federal appeals court set a precedent and ruled that free software licenses can indeed set legally binding conditions on the use of the copyrighted work, even when it is given away for free. This case proved that open source, Creative Commons, and free software licenses are fully legally enforceable under existing copyright law. Red Hat software is a classic example of how you can build a business around free software. The company was founded to sell the free Linux operating system, but they add value by providing warranty, technical support, updates, and additional value-added features. Many businesses require support contracts and are willing to pay for the privilege of using free software when it includes additional services as a condition of sale.
As the founders of Copyleft, we believe in the value of the open source community. All of our products are open source and free of charge. We do acknowledge that companies have business requirements, so we also offer technical support and training as a paid consulting service.
These are the open source libraries we have developed. Copyleft is LGPL 2.1. The other three are released under the BSD2 clause license. For more information, visit our website at www.copyleft.com.
Thank you for watching our video, and we hope you found the content of value. If you have any questions, feel free to email us or leave a message on our Copyleft form. We look forward to hearing from you.
Please make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel and come back in 2 weeks for our next video.